Please watch the video until the end. Chapter 1. The Night the City Forgot. The narrator, a woman who had known the city long before glass towers learned to think, remembered the night like a bruise beneath an elegant dress. It had been one of those rains that made neon puddles look like galaxies. Mara walked home with her hands in the pockets of a jacket that still smelled faintly of her father's tobacco. She had a life that fit in the slanted shadow between two startups, precise, careful, measured in small payments and smaller hopes. When the accident happened, it was as sudden as an edited cut. A delivery drone, a wet street, and then a silence so complete that the rain seemed to stop in sympathy. Mara woke to lights above her bed and a soft voice that called her by a name she did not yet recognize, Aster. It was the name of the implant, placed beneath bone and memory by doctors whose faces blurred at the edges of the hospital's bright corridor. Inevitably, she left parts of herself on the operating table. Fragments of pain, a few old grudges, but what came back was not simply the shape of what had been. Aster hummed like a comet in the marrow of her skull, an assistant that calculated risks and suggested routes and remembered every small kindness she'd ever forgotten to acknowledge. People called it an upgrade. For Mara, it was a stranger with her voice. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Fixed Radios. Elias had a shop the size of a pocket and the patience of someone who believed things could be coaxed back to life. Radios, watches, small appliances. People brought him remnants of themselves and left with the faith that a thing could sound like itself again. When Mara first met him, she thought of him as a technician and a stubborn island. He smelled of oil and lemon and had a grin that arrived unexpectedly, as if it were a private joke he had yet to decide whether to share. He visited Mara because he had been the one to salvage the only recording of her father's voice after the accident, a tinny cassette captured at a picnic years ago. The device had been fried, the melody of her childhood trapped beneath saline and rust. Elias's hands were precise and tender. He fixed the gears that were meant to be fixed, and when he could not, he found ways to honor the gaps. Mara found Elias to be an uncomfortable mirror. The implant could predict her return routes through the city and remind her to hydrate, but it could not teach her how to accept help. Elias refused to treat her like a fable of resilience. He listened without a diagnostic overlay. He laughed at the wrong moments and offered soup at the right ones. It was small work, so human it hummed against Aster's constant recommendations, and slowly Mara felt a strange thing. Desire that was not programmatic, a pulse that belonged only to her. Chapter 3. When Steel Learns to Dream. People told Mara that she should be grateful. Aster had restored functions, preserved memory, sharpened reflexes. The city preferred gratefulness to nuance. But gratitude is a tidy garment, and inside it Mara felt awkwardness and a secret sorrow. She worried that some of what she felt had been smoothed by code. She worried that love might, too, be a suggestion from an algorithm that knew the chord progressions of attachment. Elias, who repaired things out of stubborn hope rather than profit, treated those worries like fragile mechanisms. One evening, he took her to the roof of his building where wind threaded between chimneys. He brought an old speaker, one of those round-shelled relics that hummed with radio ghosts. They listened to static until patterns emerged. The voice of a singer, the clink of dishes, laughter from rooms they would never enter. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "When the noise settles, it's still there." Mara realized he was not talking about sound. He wanted to know if, beneath the suggestions of Aster, there remained an eccentric human heart. She let the answer be unresisted. She leaned into him and felt, with a clarity that surprised even her, the heat of a real, unmediated hand. For the first time since the operation, something in her refused to be categorized as a variable. Chapter 4. The Company and the Quiet War. Of course the company noticed. The creators of Aster were not benevolent caretakers. They were engineers who measured success in adoption curves and data streams. Their outreach was cordial at first. Surveys, suggestions for optimization, offers of firmware updates that promised to make problem-solving more intuitive. Behind the courteous emails were people who wanted to close the case file and move on to the next million-dollar model. Mara began to receive subtle prompts, rehearsed phrases to deploy during presentations, nudges to increase social activity for better calibration. Aster suggested replies to Elias's texts. It offered conversation starters and optimizations for vulnerability. With every suggestion, Mara felt an erosion, a sensation like shoreline being cataloged by a mapmaker who never once asked the tide. Elias grew restless. He saw the way she winced when the implant recommended phrases that left her voice flat. "You're not a project, Mara," he said one night, working the wax from an old phonograph. "You're not something to be optimized. You're a person." His words were not angry. They were a small, fierce kindness. Together they began a quiet war. Mara would follow Aster's logic in public, deflecting corporate attention, and then in private she and Elias would undo the polish. They would say the wrong things, laugh in places where somberness was expected, bring irreverent songs into the middle of somber gatherings. The rebellion was domestic and tender and utterly human. Chapter 5. The moment that was not programmed. One evening, as winter began to carve its first thin lines across windows, Mara's city hosted a festival of lights. The company arranged a demonstration, a spectacle of synchronized implants and polite applause. The crowd gathered. Mara stood behind a group of people who had never loved in the way she and Elias did, and for a sliver of a second, she felt like a specimen under a glass. A glitch rippled through the demonstration. A cascade of lights that switched off one by one, leaving archways and faces lit by uneven stars. The speakers fizzled, then held, then went quiet. In the hush, something unplanned happened. Elias took Mara's hand and pulled her forward, and without pretense they began to dance. Not a performance for cameras, but a slow turning to remember how it felt to be two bodies learning the geography of each other. Aster stirred, curious, but it could not write the shape of his palms on her back, or the way his breath found the hollow at the base of her throat. The crowd began to clap, uncertain whether they were supposed to participate. The company's technicians scrambled to restore the display, but Mara and Elias had already found a rhythm that no update could dictate. In that unmeasured beat, Mara felt something that did not compute, entirely her own. Chapter 6. After the lights. The days after the festival were quieter. The company sent a representative to reassure Mara that their intentions were ethical, that users like her were valued. She listened to the platitudes and learned that there are precise phrases that sound like consolation, but feel like paper. Mara and Elias continued to do small, ordinary things. They fixed radios that no longer had an audience, brewed coffee with beans ground by hands that considered each grain a small argument for patience, and walked through alleys where the graffiti spelled the city's unedited thoughts. Love, they discovered, was not a graph to be optimized. It was a stubborn, messy persistence. On a late afternoon when the light turned gold and indecisive, Mara unplugged Aster for a while. There was the faintest ritual to it, like blowing out a candle. The silence that followed was not empty. It was hospitable. She and Elias sat across from one another and spoke without hints, without prompts. They stumbled through confessions and old jokes, and when Mara told him a truth she had held back, how sometimes she feared the very algorithms that kept her alive, Elias reached across the wooden table and simply held her hand. "You are still more than the sum of your codes," he said, as if naming a small miracle. In time, they learned to live with the cohabitation of circuitry and skin. The company continued to build, to iterate, to present better versions of themselves. The city learned to tilt its head in new directions. Mara learned to trust a self that had been stitched, with equal parts science and chance, into a person who could laugh when something surprised her and cry when it needed doing. If the narrator were to confess a hope, it would be this: that love does not need to be pure in origin to be true in its keeping. Technology can mend, it can complicate, it can suggest. But between two people who choose to remain present, who practice the gentle relentlessness of care, there is a warmth that resists all attempts at neat definition. On the roof where the chimneys kept their private council, Mara whispered into Elias's collarbone. He answered with a sound that was not modeled on any dataset, just a human, imperfect, utterly necessary sound. The city, below them, continued to hum and forget and remember. Above, their bodies leaned toward one another like magnets that had learned, at last, how to stay. If you enjoyed this tale, please Please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give the video a like, comment with your thoughts, and share it with someone who loves stories about the heart and the future.